The chamber smells of beeswax and damp stone, the kind of air that makes your throat itch just by breathing it in. You hear the faint crackle of a fire that never seems to warm the corners, and there in the centre of it all lies the swaddled shape of a child who, from the very start, seemed too fragile for the heavy crown of expectations placed upon him. This is Henry FitzRoy, the illegitimate son of Henry VIII, a boy whose very existence was paraded like a trophy, but who, behind closed doors, coughed and wheezed his way through a childhood marked more by physicians than by play. You can almost see his small chest rise and fall too quickly, every breath an effort, his pale face turning toward the flickering candlelight as though the glow itself might lend him strength. And here's the cruel twist. You probably wouldn't survive being him, not for long, not in a world where privilege bought silks and feasts but couldn't outbid the grasp of disease. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time glows on the clock beside your bed. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the instant Henry VIII acknowledged FitzRoy as his son in 1519, people began watching him with both awe and suspicion. The boy was handsome enough, with the sharp Tudor nose and the red gold hair of his father, but those who held him noted the limpness in his arms, the delicate bones under his velvet clothes, and the way he tired too easily. Even in infancy, he was a bundle of contradictions, a royal child paraded in public as proof of the king's virility, yet whispered about in private as one already doomed. To the Tudor mind, a body that faltered was more than just a medical weakness. It was a divine signal. Some said it was God's way of punishing the king for his excesses. Others muttered that the boy's illegitimacy tainted him like sour wine in a golden goblet. But FitzRoy's existence mattered politically. Henry VIII, frustrated by Catherine of Aragon's inability to produce a surviving son, clung to FitzRoy as evidence that the problem wasn't with him. When the boy was about 6, the king took the extraordinary step of creating him Duke of Richmond and Somerset, showering him with titles far beyond what most bastards could ever dream of. Courtiers bowed before this frail child, while behind palace doors servants wrung out cloths to cool his fevered skin. Historians still argue whether Henry genuinely believed FitzRoy could one day succeed him, or whether the pageantry was simply a cruel bluff in the ongoing marriage battle with Catherine. Either way, the boy's body was made into a stage, and every cough or stumble became an uninvited performance. You imagine walking through the palace galleries then, hearing the thump of boots and the hush of silks as courtiers whispered in corners. They saw a boy who looked princely but faltered in health, and that contradiction unsettled them. Medicine at the time had no real answers, only endless herbal brews and bleeding rituals, so rumours filled the silence. Was the boy consumptive? Was he cursed? Did he inherit some secret Tudor flaw? One fringe theory that pops up in later centuries even suggests he carried the same genetic weakness that might explain the later infertility and miscarriages plaguing Henry's queens. The irony, if the bastard had lived long enough, he might have embodied the very dynastic rot his father was desperate to deny. And yet, in fleeting moments, FitzRoy seemed normal. He rode ponies under the watchful gaze of tutors. He laughed with young companions. He studied his Latin texts like any other boy trained for power. You can almost hear the scrape of his quill across parchment, the cough interrupting the silence, the soft sigh of a nursemaid who knew she'd be wiping blood from his lips before nightfall. That blend of brightness and fragility defined him, a boy caught between the grandeur of expectation and the failing vessel of his own body. As the candles gutter low, you realise this story isn't about a golden Tudor prince who almost was, but about a spoiled body, spoiled not by scandal, but by sickness, a body that revealed far more than Henry VIII ever wanted anyone to see. The corridors of Whitehall echo with footsteps, polished leather slapping against flagstones as courtiers rush to keep up with the king's latest parade. You trail behind, half amused at the grand spectacle, because the star of the show isn't Henry VIII himself, it's the boy he insists on presenting as proof of his vigour. Henry FitzRoy, dressed in miniature armour that gleams brighter than the child wearing it, sits stiffly on a pony too large for his frame. His face looks pinched, pale beneath the gilded helmet, but Henry beams as though England itself has been reborn in this frail figure. The irony is hard to miss. Here is a king who can break the backs of kingdoms with his appetite for power, yet he leans on the fragile body of a teenager to silence those who whisper about his cursed marriage bed. Behind the pomp, the gossip flows like spilled wine. Courtiers know what they've seen. They've heard the muffled coughs through thin chamber doors, seen the boy leave feasts early with a hand pressed discreetly against his chest. Some mutter that FitzRoy is strong enough. After all, he survived infancy, which in Tudor England was its own kind of miracle. Others smirk into their goblets, certain that the king's bastion of virility is little more than a child held together by herbal tonics and wishful thinking. Historians still argue whether Henry truly believed FitzRoy could secure the Tudor line, or whether it was all theatre, staged to convince Catherine of Aragon and the Pope that he deserved a fresh marriage bed. What you see walking alongside the crowd is a desperate gamble. Henry had already begun to doubt Catherine, her failure to produce a son gnawing at his pride. Showcasing FitzRoy wasn't just vanity, it was politics. He was declared Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and whispers even suggested the king might legitimise him, naming him heir should all else fail. But that possibility came wrapped in unease. Legitimising FitzRoy would mean rewriting centuries of succession law, enraging nobles who believed bloodline mattered more than royal will. And underneath it all lay one stubborn, unshakable truth. A dynasty can't be secured by a boy who might not live long enough to grow a beard. Still, Henry staged the gamble with flair. You imagine the court watching as the boy processed through the halls, the king's hand heavy on his shoulder, the unspoken message as loud as any proclamation. Look, I can make sons. The fault is not mine. You can almost hear the king's booming laugh, see the way he filled a room like a cannon blast, and feel the nervous laughter of courtiers forced to play along. They clapped for FitzRoy as though applauding strength might conjure it into being. But behind the curtains, reality pressed in. Attendants wrapped FitzRoy in furred robes to keep him from shivering even in summer. Physicians mixed potions of ground pearls, dried lizards, and honey to soothe the cough that rattled his chest. Quirky remedies abounded. One record even notes that Tudor doctors sometimes recommended powdered toad as a cure for weak lungs, a treatment that probably did more to alarm nurses than to ease suffering. You picture the boy forcing it down, gagging quietly as the king's servants watched, too afraid to admit that nothing worked. The gamble grew riskier as FitzRoy reached adolescence. In theory, this was the time when he should have proven himself with hunting, jousts and banquets, activities designed to flaunt Tudor masculinity. In practice, he often stayed away from tournaments, his thin body unsuited to the crashing violence of sport. Yet Henry VIII never gave up the act. Each appearance of FitzRoy became more exaggerated, more desperate, as if the king believed that public spectacle could disguise private frailty. And perhaps it worked, for a time. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the king's promising son, noting the lavish honours heaped upon him. But those same letters often carried more cautious tones, reports of lingering weakness, of a boy seen less and less in public, of a body that seemed already weary of carrying history's weight. When you step back from the noise of the court, the gamble looks less like power and more like denial. Henry VIII was wagering the stability of his realm on a child already shadowed by death. And though the dice clattered brightly in the candlelight, you can feel the weight of them falling the wrong way. The air inside FitzRoy's sick room always carried a strange weight, thick with a blend of herbs, sweat, and the faint sourness of sickness. You step through the door and it hits you like a wall. Bundles of rosemary and lavender hanging from beams, bowls of vinegar placed on the floor to purify the air, and the faint smoke of juniper wood curling in lazy spirals toward the rafters. The boy lies in bed, propped against embroidered pillows, his skin pale against the richness of the fabric. Every few minutes, a cough tears through the chamber, wet and rattling, and the attending physician leans closer, nodding as though he has understood something profound. But of course, in Tudor England, no one really understands. They're grasping at shadows, convinced that smells and humours dictate life and death. The remedies are almost theatrical. A maid carries in a small dish of powdered pearls, worth more than some villages, meant to strengthen the heart. Another servant approaches with a vial of syrup made from violets, sticky and sweet, intended to ease the cough. Then comes the stranger cures, the dried toad reduced to powder and stirred into wine, the ground horn of a unicorn, which was more likely narwhal, tusk shaved into water, or even the application of a warm pigeon split open and laid across the chest. You wince at the thought, But that was medicine's reality. The body as battlefield, and nature's oddest creatures recruited as weapons. You notice how FitzRoy doesn't complain. He swallows the concoctions dutifully, even when his throat rebels, even when his stomach clenches in protest. The boy seems to have learned early that obedience is survival, that refusing a physician's remedy would disappoint the father who saw his life as a symbol of legitimacy. His nurse wipes his lips, whispering comforts meant more for herself than for him. Outside the chamber, courtiers speculate in hushed voices about whether the Duke of Richmond can possibly live to manhood, while inside the boy's world shrinks to the size of a bed, a bowl, and the bitter taste of medicine. Historians still argue whether FitzRoy's illness was tuberculosis, the consumption that wasted countless Tudor bodies, or something else entirely. Some suspect the infamous Tudor sweating sickness, that mysterious plague that could strike suddenly and carry off a victim in a matter of hours. Others float fringe theories, syphilis, inherited perhaps from his father, though there's little proof. Whatever the truth, his symptoms made him a puzzle that Tudor medicine could never solve. Each cure offered was like a coin tossed into a well, more hope than science, more ritual than remedy. What's almost worse is how these treatments turned the sick room into a kind of theatre. Every visitor felt compelled to contribute some advice, some prayer, some object believed to hold healing power. You can picture the crowded room, priests murmuring Latin incantations, women sprinkling holy water over sheets, apothecaries haggling over which remedy should be tried next. And always, at the centre, the thin boy lying still, eyes half closed, body shrinking as the remedies piled up. In quieter moments, you imagine him turning his head toward the window, searching for air fresher than the heavy perfume of herbs and smoke. Maybe he longed to ride outside again, to feel the cool wind instead of the stagnant haze of medicine. But those moments were rare. Instead, he drifted between sleep and coughing, his dreams punctuated by the clatter of pestles grinding in mortars and the shuffle of physicians' robes. There is a sadness in realizing how much of his short life was lived here, inside these walls that smelled more like an apothecary than a home. And perhaps the saddest part is knowing that, despite the endless rituals, the endless mixtures and prayers, the boy's body was already slipping toward the silence no tincture could hold back. The night before death always feels longer than it should, stretching each minute into an hour, each hour into an eternity. You sit at FitzRoy's bedside and listen to the fragile rhythm of his breathing, every inhale a rasp, every exhale a sigh that seems too final for someone so young. The chamber is dark except for a single candle trembling in its holder, throwing nervous shadows across the walls. Nurses and attendants hover in the background, whispering to each other in voices that seem both hushed and hurried, as though speaking too loudly might scare death into coming faster. The boy lies still, eyes half closed, and you realize this is the moment everyone has been dreading, the slow unwinding of a life that had been burdened with too much meaning from the start. The remedies have stopped. No more pigeons pressed against the chest, no more powders disguised in wine, no more priests swinging incense so thick it choked the air. At this point the attendants know better. All that remains is comfort. A damp cloth pressed to the forehead, a whispered prayer repeated endlessly, and the occasional touch of a hand to remind the boy that he isn't alone. Even the king himself is absent. Henry VIII has little tolerance for deathbeds, especially those that remind him of his own fragile line. That absence speaks louder than words. Here lies the child Henry once flaunted as proof of his manhood, but when the body begins to fail it is left to servants and shadows to bear witness. You lean closer, listening to the cough that shakes FitzRoy's thin chest. Between the coughs, there are long stretches of silence. Too long. The kind that makes every person in the room stop breathing until the next ragged inhale arrives. The attendants exchange nervous glances, their faces marked by sleepless nights, and the unspoken knowledge that this boy is not going to see another dawn. You imagine the faint sound of rain against the shutters, the smell of wet earth drifting in with each draught, as if the world outside already knows it is preparing to mourn. Historians still debate what exactly took him in those final hours. Was it tuberculosis? The slow wasting sickness that hollowed out the body and filled the lungs with blood? Was it the mysterious sweating sickness that had already cut through Tudor courts like a scythe, swift and merciless? Or was it simply the exhaustion of a body too frail to carry the expectations of a kingdom? The truth remains locked inside that quiet chamber, in the stillness that follows the last breath. One quirky detail survives in rumour. Some claimed FitzRoy, in his final hours, murmured prayers for his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, showing a tenderness the politics of the court would never allow. Whether true or not, it adds a human note to the boy behind the titles, reminding you that this was no marble statue of dynasty but a teenager, frightened and fading. As the candle burns lower, the room grows colder. The attendants huddle closer together, their faces pale in the unsteady light. You hear the rustle of skirts, the shift of boots, the quiet sob of a maid who has seen too many deaths but never one so weighted with consequence. And then, at last, the silence falls for good. Not the breathless pause between coughs, but the full, heavy silence that leaves no doubt. A boy is gone. A dynasty trembles. In that moment you realise that Henry VIII's gamble has failed. The pawn he pushed so proudly across the board has been swept away, leaving the king to face the same emptiness that haunted his marriage and his throne. The long night ends not with triumph, but with the soft extinguishing of a single fragile flame. The body left behind does not rest easily. You stand in the chamber as the attendants begin their grim work, moving quickly because in Tudor England time is not a luxury when it comes to the dead. The summer air is thick, and they know how swiftly flesh can betray the illusion of royal dignity. Curtains are drawn tight, water is boiled, and cloths are laid out in neat, almost ritualistic rows. FitzRoy, once dressed in silks and gold-threaded garments, is stripped down to the fragile skin of mortality. His chest, so recently heaving with effort, lies flat now, and the silence of the room is broken only by the scrape of basins and the low instructions of stewards who have performed this task before. They work in layers, linen soaked in vinegar to cleanse the body, herbs like rosemary and thyme stuffed into the mouth and ears to slow the creeping odour, and wax poured carefully over the face to keep its shape. The smell is overwhelming, a mix of sharp vinegar, musty herbs, and the metallic tang of blood that lingers no matter how hard they scrub. To you, the scene is surreal. A boy who had been paraded as a duke is now reduced to a problem of decay, his attendants more concerned with how he looks in the coffin than with the loss of his future. In the Tudor imagination, preservation mattered almost as much as salvation. A noble corpse had to travel, sometimes for days, before it reached burial, and in that time, the line between reverence and revulsion was dangerously thin. One quirky but true practice was the use of strong wine to bathe the body, as if drowning it in luxury could hide the truth of death. There are whispers, too, that sometimes nobles' entrails were removed entirely, packed in jars and buried separately to keep the rest from spoiling too quickly. Whether FitzRoy's body underwent this treatment is uncertain, but historians still argue whether reports of corruption in his corpse suggest such steps were taken. You picture the attendants wrapping him, winding linen strips around thin limbs, tightening knots with fingers that tremble, not from grief, but from the urgency of their task. Somewhere beyond the chamber, the bells toll quietly, their sound muffled by thick walls, yet each strike a reminder to the living that the boy who carried the Tudor name is gone. The attendants glance at one another, aware that their king expects perfection. Henry VIII could not bear a scandal of rot. His son's body must appear almost untouched, a princely figure sleeping rather than spoiling. And so they keep working even as the night drags on. Candles gutter, smoke clings to the ceiling, and the boy becomes more a crafted object than a child. You can almost feel the chill that settles over the room, the sense that the attendants are not just preparing a burial but also rewriting a story, turning decay into dignity, weakness into something like grandeur. What strikes you most is how much fear hovers in the room, not just of death, but of what the body represents. A spoiled corpse is more than a medical failure. It is a political embarrassment, proof that God may not have favoured the Tudors after all. Every binding of linen, every sprinkle of crushed herbs becomes an act of denial. If they can mask the truth, perhaps the dynasty will not seem so fragile. Perhaps the king will not rage, but deep down you sense they know it's futile. A body cannot lie forever. It is only a matter of time before the truth seeps out, carried on air heavier than incense, darker than silence. The door shuts, and for a moment you think it's over, that the boy has been bound and sealed away for his final journey. But then comes the whisper, the quiet order passed from steward to surgeon. Open him. An autopsy in Tudor England is not the clean clinical affair you might imagine. It is rare, secretive, and often more about rumour than science. FitzRoy's death at 17 sparks curiosity, suspicion and fear. Too young, too important, too politically charged. To some, uncovering what spoiled him might offer answers. To others, it's simply another layer of spectacle. You step closer, bracing against the heavy smell of herbs and vinegar, as knives are laid out on a table polished by candlelight. The body is turned, linen unwound. A hush falls over the room as the surgeon makes the first incision, his blade crude compared to modern instruments, yet sharp enough to slice the illusion of dignity. There is no audience of scholars, no neat diagrams being drawn, just a few men leaning in, their faces pale, their curiosity edged with disgust. They whisper about his lungs, which collapse inward with the release of foul-smelling air, evidence perhaps of the dreaded consumption. One recalls the way he coughed blood, his pillow stained with it. Another insists it must have been the sweating sickness, invisible until it suddenly scorched the body from within. Historians still argue whether such an autopsy even took place, but Tudor rumour was insistent. What they found inside was spoiled, wasted, ruined by illness. You watch as they prod further. The stomach is said to be shrunken, the liver pale, the organs showing signs of corruption far beyond his years. One fringe detail whispered later claimed his body seemed unnaturally wasted, fueling speculation of inherited weakness in the Tudor line. And here is the scandal. A boy paraded as proof of royal virility becomes in death proof of something far more unsettling, that the line itself may be cursed with fragility. Imagine the fear this bred in a court already obsessed with heirs and plagued by miscarriages. A single spoiled body was enough to make people question the strength of the dynasty. You lean against the wall, taking in the strange blend of awe and unease. This is not medicine, it is gossip carved in flesh. Each observation will ripple outward, carried in whispers through taverns, ambassadorial letters, and the scribbled notes of chroniclers. Some will swear FitzRoy was hollowed by disease, others that he bore marks of something more scandalous, venereal illness perhaps, inherited through his father's sins. And because secrecy hangs heavy over the dissection, the lack of clarity feeds the rumour mill like meat to dogs. The surgeons finish with haste. They stuff herbs into cavities, bind the boy again, and step back as though eager to distance themselves from what they've uncovered. Their eyes, however, betray them. They've seen too much and too little at once. You sense that none of them truly know what killed him, but all of them know the story of his body will be told and retold, distorted with every retelling, until the spoiled corpse becomes a myth as much as a fact. And you can't help but think about the irony. In life, FitzRoy's body was a stage for his father's pride. In death, it becomes a stage for everyone else's fears. He is no longer a boy, not even a duke. He is evidence, an argument, a warning carved open and sealed shut again. The silence that follows feels heavier than before, as though the walls themselves are keeping secrets. You step back from the surgeon's table, the image of that spoiled body still clinging to your thoughts, and realise the whispers won't stop here. Once the linen is wrapped and the chamber swept, the question spreads like smoke. What killed him? And like any unsolved puzzle, it refuses to fade. The diseases that haunted kings were as much spectres of reputation as they were medical realities, and FitzRoy's death became a canvas for every fear the Tudors carried. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was then known, sits at the top of the list. The wasting sickness had already claimed countless lives across England, its victims marked by hollow cheeks, bloody coughs, and the slow erosion of flesh. It fits the description too neatly. The rattling breath, the crimson-stained linens, the gradual decline that shadowed the boy's adolescence. Historians still argue whether this was the true culprit, pointing to parallels in later Tudors who showed similar fragility. The disease was so common that even nobles could not escape it, though their wealth bought them slightly more comfortable beds to waste away in. But tuberculosis was not the only possibility. The infamous sweating sickness lurked like a phantom in the Tudor imagination, striking without warning and killing within hours. The disease baffled physicians with symptoms so sudden, fever, violent sweats, delirium, that entire households could be wiped out before dawn. Could FitzRoy have lingered from a slow form of it, Or was his death simply misinterpreted by physicians desperate for answers? The debate continues. Some fringe theorists even suggest syphilis, pointing to Henry VIII's own rumoured afflictions and imagining that father and son shared not just a name, but a taint passed in secret. Yet evidence for this is thin, and more likely an invention of later gossip hungry for scandal. And then there's the darker, more political interpretation, that FitzRoy's death was less about germs and more about power. Poison was always a suspicion at court, where rivals circled like hawks. Could Catherine of Aragon's allies have had reason to see the boy gone, eliminating a pawn Henry VIII might have used to legitimise his succession claims? Or was it simply convenient to blame shadowy plots, rather than admit that the Tudors, despite their crowns and their feasts, were as fragile as any peasant coughing blood in a thatched cottage? The notion of poison lingers more like theatre than truth, but you can't ignore how tightly it clung to the Tudor psyche. One quirky note that surfaces in some chronicles is that FitzRoy's decline seemed to mirror that of Edward VI, Henry's legitimate son born later. Both boys showed signs of weakness, both struggled with lingering sickness, and both died before reaching the full strength of manhood. To some, this became evidence of a hereditary flaw, something baked into the Tudor blood itself, a rot in the foundation of the dynasty. Whether rooted in fact or superstition, the idea spread like wildfire. Perhaps Henry could sire children, but he could not sire survivors. As you drift deeper into the speculation, you notice how each theory says more about the people telling it than about the boy himself. For physicians, it was consumption. For courtiers, it was poison. For chroniclers, it was divine punishment. And for Henry VIII, it was something best left unspoken, because to admit weakness in his son was to admit weakness in himself. The body's gone now, sealed away, but the questions remain. You walk down a draughty hall and realise that every cough echoing in Tudor corridors must have sounded louder after FitzRoy's death, as though each one carried the same warning. Power may build castles, but disease will always find its way inside. The silence that followed FitzRoy's death wasn't complete, not really. If you lean close enough, you can almost hear the whispers of the women who lingered in the shadows of his story. They were there all along, nurses who wiped his lips clean of blood, laundresses who scrubbed the stained linens, attendants who slipped prayers into the still air when no one was watching. They knew more of the boy's truth than most courtiers ever dared to admit. But in Tudor chronicles, their voices are little more than footnotes, erased under the weight of politics and pride. Chief among these women was Elizabeth Blount, FitzRoy's mother. Once a teenage mistress of Henry VIII, she had been discarded as quickly as she was elevated, a reminder that in the Tudor world women were celebrated for producing heirs, but forgotten once their usefulness expired. She watched her son from afar, unable to shield him from the scrutiny that turned his fragile health into a matter of state. Imagine her grief, hearing the rumours, some sympathetic, others venomous, that her boy was both a symbol of the king's strength and a warning of the dynasty's weakness. It is said she was devastated when news of his death reached her, though her mourning had no official stage, no grand procession, no Queen's vigil, just private sorrow, tucked away where it would not inconvenience the king's narrative. Around FitzRoy, other women moved silently. Wet nurses, governesses, and ladies assigned to his household created the cocoon in which he lived his short life. They administered the endless remedies, herbal brews steeped until bitter, cloths soaked in vinegar, charms tucked beneath pillows. One quirky detail buried in household accounts suggests a nurse once placed a sprig of rue under his sheets, believing it would drive away the spirits of illness. Whether FitzRoy found comfort in these rituals or simply endured them, you can picture him surrounded by women's hands, their care often the only barrier between his body and despair. Historians still argue whether women like Blount wielded any real influence at court after FitzRoy's birth. Some believe she lived quietly, fading from politics, while others suggest she remained a subtle presence, a connection to the king giving her a fragile kind of power. Either way, when her son's body failed, whatever leverage she held dissolved into silence. The dynasty could not afford to elevate her grief. It was easier to let her fade from the narrative entirely. And then there were the half-sisters, Mary, who had already been pushed aside in the succession crisis, and Elizabeth, still just a child. If FitzRoy had lived, their own futures might have been altered forever. Did they mourn him? Perhaps. But in a court where every death rearranged the chessboard of succession, mourning was complicated. Tears mixed with calculations, sorrow with survival. The women's presence lingers in the background of this story because they are the ones who carried its emotional truth. The men dissected, debated, and speculated. The women endured. They held the body, soothed the coughing, stitched the linens, and whispered prayers into the boy's ear when his father was absent. They knew the real sound of his struggle, the weight of his frailty. And when he died, their grief was swallowed up by the louder voices of politics. As you drift through the dim corridors of memory, you feel the weight of those silenced women pressing close. Theirs is the story beneath the story, the quiet chorus reminding you that history isn't written only in proclamations and treaties, but also in the hands that held a boy as he coughed himself toward death. You walk further into the echoing corridors of Tudor memory and realise FitzRoy's spoiled body was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern, a dynasty of rot that seemed to gnaw at Henry VIII's line from within. His death at 17 was a warning, but the warning went unheeded. Not long after, when Jane Seymour gave Henry the legitimate son he craved, the court erupted in celebration. Edward VI, pale and delicate, was swaddled in silk and declared the answer to England's prayers. And yet, as you know, Edward's story carried the same shadows. His youth spent between tutors and sickbeds, his chest rattling with the same kind of cough that had silenced FitzRoy. In the end, he too died before reaching manhood, leaving behind a kingdom torn between heirs, faiths, and factions. You cannot help but feel the irony. Henry VIII broke a nation apart to secure sons, shattering his marriage, splitting his church, executing wives and friends, only to find that his longed-for boys could not carry the weight of the crown. His bastards faltered. His legitimate son withered. It was his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who survived, who endured, who proved the most formidable heirs of all. Historians still argue whether Henry's obsession with male succession blinded him to the strength his daughters would later embody, or whether the irony was lost on him entirely as he drifted into decline. The theme of spoilage didn't stop with FitzRoy or Edward. Even Henry himself became a grotesque symbol of decay. In his later years, swollen, ulcerous, carried from room to room like a bloated relic of former glory, the king's own body mirrored the fragility of the dynasty he had sacrificed so much to build. Foreign ambassadors whispered about the stink of his wounds, courtiers wrinkled their noses as they bowed, and servants fanned away the smell of rot. A dynasty of grandeur was also a dynasty of flesh, and flesh, no matter how gilded, always breaks down. There's a fringe but fascinating theory whispered by some scholars that the Tudors carried a genetic flaw, perhaps something akin to the Kell blood group incompatibility, which might explain the string of miscarriages suffered by Henry's wives and the fragile health of his sons. Imagine it, the king tearing apart his kingdom in search of an heir, when the real enemy was hidden in his own blood, something no annulment or execution could cure. It's the kind of bitter twist that history loves best, turning pride into downfall with a cruelty no playwright could improve. One quirky comparison often drawn is to fruit rotting in a bowl. The Tudors presented themselves as golden apples, polished and perfect in portraits, yet beneath the paint lay bruises spreading silently. You remember FitzRoy's body on the surgeon's table, the spoiled organs whispered about in rumour. You remember Edward coughing into silk pillows. You picture Henry's ulcerous legs. It is a dynasty forever caught between splendour and decay, power and fragility. And yet, from that rot came resilience. Mary would rise, brutal and determined, earning the name Bloody Mary for her religious persecutions, her own body later betraying her in phantom pregnancies. Elizabeth, against all odds, would transform the kingdom into something greater, ruling with an iron wit and a body that stubbornly outlasted the fragile men before her. It is tempting to see their survival as a kind of revenge, the daughters proving what the sons could not. That strength did not always come from the direction the king had demanded. You can almost hear the whispers echoing through Whitehall after FitzRoy's death, whispers that would never quite leave. The Tudors, for all their grandeur, could not escape the shadow of their own frailty. Their line was a house of magnificence built on bodies that spoiled too quickly, leaving behind the question of whether their greatest weakness was not politics or religion, but flesh itself. The procession is quiet, almost subdued, as FitzRoy's body is carried away, bound in its final wrappings. You trail alongside, the sound of boots muffled on damp earth, the bells tolling somewhere in the distance. There is no triumph here, no grand air laid to rest with all the pomp of a future king. Instead, there is something muted, as though the court itself knows not to draw too much attention to the awkward fact that the boy Henry VIII paraded as his proof has ended up spoiled, wasted, gone before he even had a chance to rule. The burial itself is modest by Tudor standards. FitzRoy is interred at Thetford Priory, far from Westminster, far from the thunderous tombs of kings. You can picture the cold stone walls, the flicker of candles along the nave, the low chant of monks filling the space like a sigh. The boy lies in his coffin, face covered in wax to hide the ravages of illness, hands folded over his chest as though in eternal prayer. Those gathered murmur the words of liturgy, their voices rising and falling like waves. And yet under it all the air feels uneasy, heavy with the awareness that what lies inside that coffin was not just a child, but a story of weakness that Henry would rather erase. Time, however, has no loyalty to royal wishes. Thetford Priory itself would later be dissolved, FitzRoy's tomb moved, his remains shifting with the tides of religious reform and political upheaval. His name faded from memory, eclipsed by the louder reigns of sisters and queens, his short life remembered only in fragments. You imagine standing in those ruins centuries later, weeds creeping over stone, the whispers of monks long gone. Somewhere beneath the ground lies what remains of the boy, a body once dissected, debated and wrapped in linen, now nothing but dust. Historians still debate the meaning of his death. Some see it as a turning point in Henry's desperation for heirs, fueling the marriage crises that would unravel England. Others view it as an afterthought, a footnote overshadowed by the drama of Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour and the queens that followed. But for you, walking back through this story, FitzRoy's body lingers as more than rumour. It becomes a symbol of the futility of power against fragility, of a dynasty that demanded perfection from flesh that could never deliver. One quirky, almost poetic detail. Centuries later, when people visit the ruins of Thetford, they rarely stop to think of the boy buried there. Instead, they marvel at the crumbling arches, the carved stones, the ghosts of monks. FitzRoy has become invisible again, his story folded into silence. And yet, if you lean in close, if you let the silence stretch, you can almost hear the faint echo of a cough, the sound of a boy who lived too short, too frail, too spoiled by both illness and expectation. As the last candle gutters out, the image that remains is not of a duke in finery or a prince in procession, but of a wasted heir whose body revealed truths his father's proclamations never could. A body that told England, quietly but unmistakably, that crowns may glitter, but flesh will always spoil. Now let the noise of the court drift away, fading like the toll of distant bells. The sharp images of candlelit chambers, coughing fits, and whispered rumours soften, dissolving into something quieter. You're no longer standing beside a sickbed, nor trailing through echoing corridors, nor leaning over a surgeon's table. Instead, you find yourself floating gently back from the story, as though the past itself is releasing you, loosening its grip. The Tudors and their spoiled heirs become just shadows behind glass, figures painted in dim colours, fading the further you drift. What remains is not the weight of their sorrow, but the calm reminder that all stories, even the darkest, settle eventually into silence. The boy's body, once so fiercely guarded and whispered about, is dust now. And dust is light, carried on air, no longer heavy with expectation. Take a breath, slow and steady. Let your shoulders ease, let your thoughts soften. The stones of ruined abbeys crumble into moss, the candle flames fade into darkness, and the world outside grows hushed. Rest now, knowing the past has been laid down gently, like linen folded over sleep. And of course, historians argue about how widespread these traditions were. Some see them as exceptions, isolated moments of humanity. Others believe they were crucial parts of soldiering life, ritualized humour and storytelling acting as armour of their own. You'd side with the latter. Out here a joke can feel as essential as a blade. Garwin finishes a new verse and bows low, arms spread wide like a theatre performer. Everyone claps with their mittens and cracked gloves, a sound like dead leaves rustling. Then all heads turn to you. Your turn, Hal says. You blink. What? You've been here long enough, Garwin says. It's your verse. You shake your head. I don't sing. Doesn't have to rhyme, someone says. Doesn't have to be good, someone else adds. You think for a second, then longer. You stare into the fire, eyes tracking the embers. You remember a song your mother used to hum while mending socks. You can't remember the words, just the melody. Something simple and low. You hum it now, barely above a whisper, and the group leans in. It's a lullaby. Maybe. Or a harvest tune. You make up new words as you go. Something about the sun rising. Something about muddy boots and stiff fingers. Something about surviving just one more day. By the time you finish, no one claps. They just nod. And that's more than enough. The song circles around the fire again. More verses. More jokes. Someone tries to stand and slips in the snow, which gets a laugh that feels almost healthy. Like people who remember how lungs should feel when they're not filled with smoke or frost or fear. Eventually the singing slows. Men begin to peel off one by one, ducking back into tents. But something has changed. The air feels warmer, not by temperature but by presence. You head back into your own tent, wrap yourself up in your bedroll and settle in. Rafe's asleep, still breathing easy. You glance over and smile. Outside the wind howls, the fire dies, the cold returns, but you've got a song stuck in your head. And that might just be enough to carry you through. There are two kinds of tired out here. The kind that makes your body ache, and the kind that makes your soul ache. Tonight, you're both. Your legs feel like they've been carved from frozen timber, your eyelids keep dipping like they're pulling shutters down on your brain, and your breath is so shallow you wonder if your lungs are protesting the very concept of continued existence. You're walking sentry duty again. Surprise. The thing about night watch is that it doesn't care if you slept. It doesn't care if you've eaten, if your hands are bleeding from hauling water buckets, or if you're still nursing a burn on your palm from the last time you tried to stoke a fire and the log had opinions. The schedule rotates, and when your name's up you stand, or walk, or lean until someone yells at you. You wrap your cloak tighter and rub your eyes with fingers like stone. You can barely feel them anymore. The air tonight isn't just cold, it's mean. It claws at your nose, stings your cheeks, and seeps through every seam in your clothing like it's hunting for places you forgot to patch. Your boots are stiff, the straw insulation inside now reduced to a damp mulch of frost and foot sweat. You can feel the blisters forming and freezing all at once. You start walking your circuit, slow, steady, a loop around the fire pits, the officers' tents, and the latrine trench that somehow smells worse when it freezes. You count your steps. It helps. Keeps the mind moving, which keeps the feet moving. It's all connected. If you let your thoughts stop, your legs will too. And if your legs stop, well, you've seen what happens. The world is still. Snow whispers across the ground in soft, lazy drifts. You step lightly, trying not to make too much noise. Everything out here sounds louder at night. Your boots crunch like boulders. Your breath might as well be a war drum. Every time the wind shifts, you turn instinctively, half expecting to see something watching you. You never do. But that doesn't mean it's not there. You stop for a moment near the edge of camp, where the tree line hovers like a line of silent witnesses. The trees are bare now, their branches thin and sharp against the night sky. You swear one of them moves, then realise it's just your vision swimming from exhaustion. Then, a sound. Behind you. You whip around, heart slamming your ribs, hand instinctively gripping the hilt of your dull dagger. But it's just another watchman, pale-faced and squinting, walking the opposite circuit. He gives you a tired nod. You return it. No words exchanged. Words take warmth. Warmth takes energy. Energy is rationed like food. You keep walking. Here's your historical context in case you're wondering how soldiers stayed alert during night watches in conditions like this. They didn't. Not always. Not well. Some commanders tried rotating watches in 90-minute intervals, just long enough to get cold, not long enough to collapse. Others assigned two-man teams, one to walk, one to slap the other if he nodded off. There are records of soldiers tying bells to their ankles so the sound would stop if they passed out mid-step. And your fringe detail for tonight. In one 14th century winter campaign, soldiers tied strings around their wrists connected to a sharp stick dug into the ground. If they started to drift while sitting, the string would pull taut and the stick would jab their hand. Medieval alarm clocks. Pain-powered and probably not very effective, but creative nonetheless. Historians argue about how effective night watches were at all in winter. Some suggest that they were ceremonial more than practical, meant to instill discipline and give the illusion of control. Others believe that the watch rotations, though brutal, were critical in deterring enemy scouts and protecting what little morale remained. Either way, the soldiers on duty didn't have much say in it. You reach the fire pit again. It's mostly ash now, with a few glowing coals buried deep. You kick it with your boot. It exhales a puff of smoke and nothing more. No warmth, just the ghost of it. You sit for a moment, crouch near the edge, elbows on your knees, trying not to fall asleep, but you do. Not long, maybe a minute, maybe less. Just long enough to feel your body start to go soft. Your jaw slackens, your fingers curl inward. The cold starts slipping in like a snake under a blanket. Then a slap. Not on the face, on the back, sharp and sudden. You lurch forward and twist around, blinking in the half-dark. It's the other sentry again, frowning. "You were out," he says simply. You nod. "Thanks." He nods back and then he's gone. You get up. Force your legs to move. You're angry now, not at him, not even at the cold. At yourself for giving in, for letting go, even for a second. Out here, a second's enough to kill you. Not from a sword, not from an arrow, from your own body saying just rest. But you can't, so you walk harder. You slap your arms, stamp your feet. You even sing to yourself. Quiet, tuneless, just a single phrase repeated again and again. You don't even know what it means anymore. It's just sound, just rhythm, just survival. Eventually, finally, blessedly, your shift ends. You hand your post over to the next man. He looks worse than you, which is comforting in a miserable sort of way. And you limp back to your tent, breath wheezing, legs shaking. You crawl into your shield bed, pulling the blanket over your face, trembling. Rafe stirs beside you. You think he says something, but your brain's already shutting down. The last thing you hear before sleep grabs you by the throat is Hal whispering, "You make it through another night?" You don't answer, but yes, you did. You wake up to quiet. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind you'd get in a safe, warm bed surrounded by wool blankets and a loyal dog curled at your feet, but a wrong kind of quiet. The kind that makes your skin crawl before your brain's fully caught up. No clinking of metal, no coughing fits, no shouted insults drifting from the mess pit. Just stillness. Heavy. Unnatural. Even the wind seems to have taken the morning off. You sit up slowly, blinking the crust of sleep from your lashes, and glance around the tent. Rafe is still asleep, chest rising and falling, thank whatever small gods might be listening. Hal is curled in a tight ball, nose buried in his scarf. There's frost on the inside of the canvas. Again. You scrape a bit off with your thumb and shake it off like dust, and then you hear it. Crunch. Not nearby, distant. Outside the camp perimeter. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Snow underfoot. You freeze. You know the sound of a soldier trudging through snow. Fast. Rhythmic. Rushed. This isn't that. This is slow. Measured. One step. Wait. Another step. Like someone trying not to be heard, which of course makes them even louder. You nudge Hal awake with your boot. He grunts. 5 more minutes. "Get up," you whisper. "Something's moving." His eyes snap open. He's alert instantly. That's one upside of this life. You never truly sleep. You just rest with your eyes shut, waiting for something to go wrong. You grab your spear from beside your bed, splintered near the base but still sharp enough to discourage poor decisions, and step outside into the snow. The air is thick. Not foggy, but heavy, like the sky's pressing down on the earth. Clouds hang low, grey and bloated with more snow. The fire pits are smouldering piles of ash. A few men are already up, shuffling around, rubbing their hands, muttering about sore joints. No one's noticed the sound yet. You turn toward the edge of the camp toward the tree line, and there, just past the ridge, you hear it again. Crunch, then silence. You raise a hand, motioning to another sentry. He nods and heads off in a slow, looping arc, trying not to draw attention. You do the same, moving with careful steps along the outer ring of tents, eyes darting, ears straining. The snow dampens sound, but you're certain. Someone, or something, is out there. You reach the ridge and peer over. Nothing, just trees, blanketed in snow, still as statues, but that silence, it's a trap. Nature doesn't go quiet unless something's wrong. You take a step forward, just one. Crunch. This time it's not from the forest, it's behind you. You spin around, spear raised, heart thundering. It's Garwin. He looks pale, paler than usual, eyes wide, lips parted. "There's someone in the tree line," he says. "I saw movement." "I know," you mutter. "I heard it." The two of you stand there, backs to each other, weapons up. Nothing moves, no arrows fly, no enemy charges in. After a while it just stops. The sound, the feeling, the tension. Eventually a sergeant stomps over and demands to know why two idiots are standing around like statues with sticks. You explain. He shrugs. Could have been a scout. Could have been a deer. Could have been your imaginations. He's not wrong. But you don't believe him either. You return to camp on edge, every muscle tight. Every sound now feels louder, every movement sharper. You sit by the fire, poking at the embers, but your mind is still out in those woods, watching. And here's a little historical note for your paranoia. Soldiers in winter often reported hearing things at night. Not just enemy movement, but footsteps that didn't match any known pattern. Figures slipping between trees, whispers in dead air. Some were probably scouts or deserters. Others? Who knows? Your fringe fact. In Eastern European winter campaigns, some soldiers carved faces into tree trunks near camp and called them watchers. They believed the carved eyes would see what they could not. Spirits, enemies, death itself. Some even swore by hanging offerings, bits of bread, coins, tiny pouches of salt, to keep the forest from turning against them. And the scholarly debate? Some chalk these reports up to exhaustion-induced hallucinations. The combination of extreme cold, chronic hunger, and constant fear has been known to play cruel tricks on the mind. Others argue that these stories, so common, so eerily consistent, point to real encounters with scouts, enemy rangers, or locals watching from the shadows waiting to strike. You don't know what you heard, but something was out there. Later, after the false alarms faded and most of the camp has gone back to worrying about soup and sanitation, you sit with Hal and Garwin by the trench fire. Hal's carving something from a chunk of wood. A little figurine. A man with a shield and one leg shorter than the other. "Gonna name him?" you ask. "Yeah," Hal mutters. "First thing that tries to sneak into camp again is gonna meet Sir Stabs a lot." You chuckle, then fall quiet. The fire crackles, the snow falls. You can't stop thinking about the sound of those steps in the snow. Even now you swear you can hear them. Even now you listen harder. Because sleep is one thing, but being watched, that's something else entirely. Sometimes survival doesn't come from planning, or discipline, or even strength. It comes from blind, ridiculous luck. That kind of luck you don't question, because if you think too hard about how close you came to freezing to death the night before, you start to unravel. Today is one of those days. You wake to smoke. Not the choking kind, not the kind that has you stumbling for the tent flap and waving your arms like a beheaded chicken, but the warm kind, the good kind. You blink awake and see light slanting through the fabric above you, and you smell it. Real smoke. Firewood smoke. Thick. Dry. Not from wet pine or horse dung, from actual honest firewood. You sit up fast, startling Hal, who drops his makeshift whittling knife and mutters something about nightmares. Rafe is awake too, propped up on his elbow, face flushed but no longer slick with fever sweat. You blink at him. He gives you a weak, lopsided grin. "I didn't die," he croaks. You don't say anything. You just grin back and pat his shoulder. Then you throw your cloak around yourself and march outside barefoot like a madman. And there it is. Smoke curling up from half a dozen new fires around camp. Soldiers hauling armloads of wood, dragging broken chairs, thick logs, actual dry timber across the snow like ants discovering a sugar pile. You stop one of them, bright-eyed, too energetic for this hour. He points down toward the southern edge of the camp and says two words that feel like a gift from the gods. Abandoned village. Turns out a scout unit stumbled across it 2 miles out during a patrol meant to check for enemy movements. A handful of crumbling huts, long empty half-rotted roofs, but still standing. And inside those huts, wood, dry furniture, crates, shelves, broken tools, floorboards that hadn't yet rotted through. Even, miracle of miracles, stacks of firewood still sitting in a collapsed lean-to, left behind by some poor soul who probably fled the war months ago and never came back. It's not a resupply, not officially, but it feels like one. It's the best thing that's happened in weeks. The camp surges with sudden motion. Fires spring up everywhere. You run, Yes, run, to help carry in more. Your hands go numb again from gripping wood, but you don't care. Every log you throw onto a sled is another hour of warmth you didn't think you'd get. The officers act like they planned it. Of course they do. They send down orders for rationed burning. Don't use it all at once. But you can already hear someone in the mess tent making plans to cook stew properly for the first time in forever. Not just boil scraps in water until it's grey and apologetic. Real stew, with colour, with flavour, probably. Here's your warm little historical fact. Scavenging abandoned villages wasn't just common, it was standard. Whole winter campaigns sometimes depended on the ruins of civilian life to survive. Burned out farmhouses, looted barns, deserted cottages. Anything that still had walls and wasn't swarming with disease was fair game. Soldiers would strip them of everything. Wood, cloth, grain, tools, furniture, doors, even roof beams. And the fringe fact. In more than a few accounts, troops found things other than supplies. Letters nailed to doors, family heirlooms hidden under floorboards, makeshift shrines in cellars where someone clearly died praying. One French infantry unit supposedly found a perfectly preserved wedding dress hanging in a closet, untouched by mould or mice. The captain burned it for kindling. The scholarly debate here is as dark as it is practical. Were these scavenged villages truly abandoned, or just emptied in panic with families intending to return? Some argue the line between pillaging and survival blurred beyond recognition in winter. Others claim armies kept records of what they took, even attempted compensation. But most of the men doing the scavenging weren't reading or writing anything. They were just trying not to die. By midday, the camp is transformed. There are fires in every ring of tents now. Smoke rises like signal flares. You can see men with their boots off for the first time in days, steaming their socks near the flames, grimacing as the blood rushes back into their toes. Someone sings. Someone else is even laughing, which hasn't happened in so long it sounds almost wrong. You can hear stew bubbling over one of the bigger fires, and you swear to every saint you can name, it smells like meat, not just bones, actual meat. You head back to your tent carrying an armload of split wood, half of it still dusted with cobwebs. You drop it near the fire pit where Hal is feeding sticks into the flame like they're letters from a hated ex. Rafe sits up, blanket over his shoulders, hands extended, colour returning to his face. You toss him one of the smaller logs. Build your strength. He catches it with shaky hands, grinning. If this is heaven, it smells like smoke and wet socks. You eat that night like kings. Well, like medieval peasant kings. The stew is thin but flavourful. The meat? Probably squirrel. Maybe bird. Maybe something unnameable. You don't ask. You just chew, swallow, and feel something warm settle in your gut for the first time in weeks. You almost cry. You'd blame the smoke, but there's no point pretending. Everyone's a little weepy tonight. You stay up later than usual, not because you're afraid, not because you're on watch, just because it's comfortable. The fire's strong. The smoke isn't in your eyes. The wind's gentler. The tent feels safer. Like maybe, just maybe, you'll sleep through the whole night without waking up to a collapsed wall or a scream in the dark. You lie down eventually, rolling onto your shield bed, pulling the blanket high, and letting your body sink instead of seize. Rafe mutters something in his sleep. Nothing feverish, just a half-mumbled story. Hal's snoring, loud but weirdly comforting now. Outside, the fire crackles, and for the first time in what feels like years, the cold isn't winning. Not tonight. You dream of green things, of sunlight, grass so thick it tickles your ankles, of a market square in full bloom, baskets of pears, apricots, soft bread steaming on wooden boards. Somewhere, someone's playing a lute, badly, but the tune is cheerful and you're warm, actually warm. You can feel it on your arms, on your cheeks. You're not wearing boots, you're not wearing 3 layers of crusty wool. You're barefoot, smiling. Someone laughs behind you, might be Hal, might be Rafe, and when you turn to look, the wind slaps you straight in the face with a mouthful of snow and smoke. Back to reality. You jerk awake, the flap of your tent slapping wildly against its ties as a gust barrels through the camp. The fire's nearly out. Hal's already up, bent over the embers, muttering to himself and trying to coax them back to life with whatever kindling he can grab in the dark. Rafe groans beside you, coughing into his blanket. Not quite better, not quite worse. "What time is it?" you croak, your throat dry as pine bark. "Time to curse the gods," Hal replies. You sit up, shaking off the last shreds of that peaceful dream like someone trying to forget a warm bath in the middle of a snowstorm. Outside the tent, the wind is doing its best impersonation of a vengeful spirit. You unzip the flap and peek out. Darkness. The kind that eats torches and steals your sense of direction. You catch a few glowing dots, fires still burning across the camp, struggling to stay alive. But even those look dimmer today. And then it hits you. Not the cold, not the wind, the smell. Something's burning, and not firewood, not stew, a canvas. You throw your cloak on and stumble outside barefoot again. Why is it always barefoot? Just in time to see the east corner of the camp in chaos. A tent's caught fire, flames licking up into the early dawn like they're hungry for more. Men are shouting. Someone's dragging out a collapsed pole. Another is kicking snow onto the flames. There's panic, but it's slow. Everyone's half awake. Boots untied, cloaks flapping. It looks like a clumsy dance performed by exhausted ghosts. You run toward the fire without thinking. It's not close to your tent, but that doesn't matter. If it spreads, everything is at risk. Winter fire is the cruelest irony. You spend your whole day trying to find warmth, and then it turns on you and eats your house. You grab a bucket, cracked, frozen at the rim, and start hauling snow onto the edge of the flames. Others join in. Someone throws a cloak over the top, smothering part of it. The canvas hisses, smoke curling up in dark coils. The smell is sharp, chemical, and bitter. You keep your mouth closed and your head low. After what feels like an hour but is probably just 10 minutes, the fire dies. You're soaked. You're freezing. You've got burns on your wrists from getting too close, and your feet feel like blocks of raw meat. But it's out. What's left of the tent is a scorched skeleton. Blackened poles, half-melted buckles, smouldering fabric. Inside, a pile of gear and blankets ruined beyond use. No one says a word. You all just stare. Eventually, the medic wanders over, mutters something about a dropped coal, and then walks off like none of it happened. And here's your sad slice of historical context. Campfires in medieval winter camps were both salvation and death traps. Tents were packed tight, men huddled close, gear stacked everywhere. One overturned pot, one slipped ember, one soldier falling asleep too close to a flame, and it all went up like dry hay. Fire drills didn't exist. Prevention was just common sense, and in the freezing dark, common sense was usually the first thing to die. Your fringe fact for this round. Some units in colder climates use stone trench fires, pits dug beneath the sleeping area, filled with slow-burning coals and covered with slabs or tiles to radiate heat through the ground. It was effective when it didn't suffocate everyone. There are recorded cases of whole tents dying overnight from smoke inhalation, because someone sealed the flap too tight and forgot to leave ventilation. Warm bodies, cold corpses, and historians debate whether fire safety was even taught in camp. Some argue that veteran soldiers passed it down like folklore. Don't sleep too close to the flame. Don't trust a dry tent in the wind. Others say no one really learned until after something burned. Trial by fire, literally. You shuffle back to your tent, soaked through, skin numbed, smoke in your hair. You peel off your wet socks and sit by the pit while Hal builds the fire back up. Rafe says nothing, but his eyes follow your every move. He saw the flames too, saw how fast it happened. Eventually he whispers, "Could have been us." You nod. Almost was. The rest of the day passes in a haze. No one talks much. The burned tent smoulders all morning. A few men salvage bits of gear. Bent cooking pans, scorched boots, a melted helmet strap. You hear the sergeant say it was a new recruit who caused it. Some kid who slept too close to the fire pit knocked the tripod down in his sleep. He lived, lost half his gear, his pride too. You wonder if he'll laugh about it someday, but not today. The new firewood from the abandoned village keeps the camp alive through it all. Fires are smaller now. Everyone's suddenly cautious. No more feeding the flames like they're gods demanding tribute. You tend yours with care, adjusting logs with a stick, watching the sparks closely. Every crackle sounds louder. Every ember looks like a threat. At night you triple-check your fire before sleeping. You set a stone between your shield bed and the flames, a reminder not to roll too close. You put your boots where they won't melt if something flares up. You wrap your cloak tight and curl into yourself like a question mark. Outside, the wind howls again, a reminder. The cold doesn't care about fire safety. And now, neither do you. Because now you've seen what happens when warmth turns to warning. By now, winter feels less like a season and more like a siege. Not just on your body, but on your mind, on the fragile scaffolding that holds your thoughts together. You can't remember what the camp smelled like before everything froze. You can't remember what your own voice sounded like when it wasn't raspy from cold air and ash. Most days you don't even remember what you're fighting for. Not really. The banners are still there, flapping at half-mast on poles that creak in the wind, but the colours are faded, the symbols worn. You stare at them sometimes and think, we must have cared once. Today, though, you don't have time for memory lapses or existential brooding. Today, you're fixing the latrines. Again, you've been assigned to dig new trenches. The old ones are frozen over, useless. The pit walls have caved in from too much snow and too many booted feet. The smell alone is enough to turn your stomach inside out. But the real danger isn't the stench, it's disease. The medic gave a lovely little speech yesterday about how filth is the back door death always comes through. He said it twice. You're still not sure if he meant that metaphorically or if he's seen it literally happen. So here you are now, holding a rusted shovel with a split handle and squinting at a patch of ground so frozen it might as well be solid iron. You jab it with the shovel. Nothing. You jump on it. Still nothing. Eventually Hal joins you, armed with a pickaxe he liberated from one of the supply carts, and you take turns hammering at the ground like condemned men building their own graves. You think noblemen ever dig their own latrines? Hal asks between swings, breath steaming in the air like smoke from a dying fire. You smirk. They don't even wipe their own arses. Sounds like a promotion, he grunts. You finally manage to break through the top crust of earth, and beneath it is cold, wet mud. That's the prize. You start shoveling like it's treasure, tossing slush and soil into a heap. It's slow, back-breaking work, but it's work, and work means you're moving, and moving means you're not freezing. Here's your charming medieval reality check. Sanitation in winter camps was a nightmare. In warm seasons, waste pits could be dug and covered quickly. But in winter, the ground fought back. Latrines froze solid, overflowed, or collapsed. Soldiers relieved themselves in snowbanks, behind tents, even in empty cooking pots, some of which made their way back into circulation. You don't want to think about that too much, but you do, often. And for your delightfully disgusting fringe fact, some soldiers, especially in prolonged winter sieges, used portable commodes carved from wood, carried out beyond the tents, and emptied at designated dump sites. These were prized, traded, and even stolen. One account describes a man being flogged for making off with a carved oak seat lined with fur. Yes, fur. For the noble backside, of course. Scholars still bicker about whether these hygiene issues were properly addressed or just ignored until someone died from them. Some argue that officers implemented basic systems, pit rotations, lime dumps, clean zones. Others point out the massive disease outbreaks that followed nearly every winter campaign, suggesting that whatever systems existed didn't really work. By midday, you've carved out a decent trench, shallow, muddy and crooked, but it'll do. You brace the edges with sticks and pack snow around the sides so it doesn't cave in again. Garwin appears just in time to not help at all. He observes your muddy masterpiece with the air of someone inspecting fine sculpture. "Look at this," he says, arms crossed. "A throne fit for a king." You jab the shovel into the ground, more like a grave fit for a peasant. Same difference out here. You finish just as the sky starts spitting snow again, light at first, then thicker, the kind that clings to every hair on your head and fills your boots before you notice. You trudge back to camp, limbs aching, boots caked with half-frozen earth, and fingers raw from gripping splintered wood all morning. The fire pit's been restoked. Thank the gods. You thaw your hands, eating a bit of stale bread and drinking water boiled with something bitter the medic claims is good for the blood. You try not to think about the last time he said that. Hal sits beside you, silent, rubbing his left arm like it's full of needles. You don't ask. Rafe's outside now, bundled and upright, walking small circles to build up his strength again. He waves at you with his good hand, the other wrapped in cloth. The fever never fully broke, but it didn't kill him either. That's the kind of victory you count now, half-deaths, almosts. The snow continues into the evening, steady, soft, relentless. You catch yourself staring at the fire again, at the way the flames shift, the way they seem to dance no matter how tired they are. You think about your family, not their faces, not clearly, just the feeling of them. A sister's laughter, a mother's hand brushing your hair, a father's quiet sigh at the end of a long day. You wonder what they'd say if they saw you now, mud-covered, smoke-stained. digging trenches and sleeping on a shield bed like a stray dog curling in the ashes, would they cry? Would they laugh? Would they even recognise you? You crawl into your tent late. Hal's already asleep, boots on, hands tucked into his belt like a baby bird. Rafe's snoring softly, finally deep in real sleep instead of fever dreams. You lie back, you breathe, you ache, but you're still here. Tomorrow maybe you'll help build a sled to haul more firewood, or maybe you'll hunt rats. Maybe you'll end up digging another trench because someone couldn't wait. Maybe you won't wake up at all. But for now, you pull the blanket up to your chin, close your eyes, and let the warmth of the fire clinging to your skin pretend it'll last. You wake to a silence that isn't unsettling for once. It's calm. A rare kind of hush, like the world paused mid-sentence and forgot what it was going to say. There's no wind battering the tent walls, no shrieking gusts dragging snow like claws across canvas. Just a low, gentle stillness, the kind that makes you stay lying down a little longer, soaking it in. You stretch slowly, surprised when your joints don't complain as loudly as usual. Outside you hear boots in snow, not stumbling, not angry, but steady, purposeful. Rafe is already up, judging by the missing lump of his bedroll. When you poke your head outside, the camp looks different. There's a glow over everything. The sky is pale, almost golden, and the snow has settled like frosting. No blizzard, no footprints yet, just soft drifts piled neatly against tents and crates. Someone's sweeping the path near the fire pit with a bundle of branches. A few soldiers hum to themselves while boiling water. There's no yelling, no chaos. You swear even the sergeant is speaking instead of barking. You step outside and instantly feel it. The air is cold, yes, but it's not angry. There's no bite to it. You can breathe without pain. It's as if the weather too has decided to give up the fight for a day. You head toward the mess tent and spot Rafe there, sitting by the fire, a cup of something hot steaming in his hands. He looks almost normal, pale, tired, still thinner than he should be, but alive in a way he hasn't looked in weeks. He sees you, lifts the cup in a salute, and smiles. "Guess we survived the worst of it," he says. You don't answer right away. You sit beside him, letting the warmth from the flames crawl up your frozen sleeves, and watch the snow melt in puddles around your boots. You think of all the mornings that started with dread, with shivering, with smoke and frost and men cursing the sky. And now, here you are, sitting still, breathing easy. You finally reply, "Maybe." The camp has shifted in other ways too. Someone is boiling cloth strips over a brazier to make fresh bandages. Someone else is hammering together a sled from scrap wood and broken shield frames. There's even talk, quiet, cautious, but real, about the weather turning, about the snow melting, about roads opening again. A few soldiers even start unpacking gear that's been frozen in crates for weeks. Oiled leather, fresh twine, a half-rotted wheel from a cart no one remembered existed. It feels like spring is whispering under the snow, even if it hasn't made an entrance yet. And here's your final bit of historical clarity. Medieval armies, when trapped in winter, waited. Not just for weather, or resupply, or even orders, but for a break. A single day when things didn't go wrong, and when that day came, it didn't mean everything was fixed. It meant you could breathe, reorganize, patch what could be patched, mourn what needed mourning, and prepare. Your fringe fact for the finish. In some winter camps, there were rituals for this kind of day. Quiet meals eaten together, stories passed around the fire, even moments of song or silence that weren't about morale but memory. Little ceremonies of survival. A way to mark that somehow, against the odds, they were still there. Historians sometimes argue whether these days really happened. Some claim they're a romantic ideal, stitched together from memoirs and embellished letters home. Others believe they were real and crucial, that without them the machinery of men would have simply ground to a halt. After all, an army can fight hunger, cold, and war, but only if it remembers why it's still breathing. That night, you lie back in your bedroll listening to the snow drip from the edges of the tent. A slow rhythm, not an attack, just weather. Rafe is already asleep, blanket pulled to his chin. Hal snores softly on your other side, one hand resting on his carved wooden figurine. Sir Stabs-a-Lot still watching over the camp. You close your eyes and for once there's no fear in the darkness, no flinching at phantom sounds, no tensing at the wind, just rest. Earned, undeniable, complete. You made it. So here you are, at the end of it. Still breathing, still wrapped in that smoky wool blanket, your shield bed creaking beneath you, your hands thawing beside a fire that you helped keep alive. You've seen the worst of it, the frostbite, the sickness, the sleepless nights that blurred into one long bitter haze. You learned how to sleep in armour, how to ignore the lice, how to joke in the face of hunger, and how to watch for death in the shape of snowflakes and silence. You huddled with strangers until they became brothers. You learned which trees made the best kindling, which jokes could make a man laugh through cracked lips, and how to patch a tent with the lining of your own cloak. You dreamed of warm kitchens and woke to the sting of ice in your beard. You held on to scraps of faith, not in gods maybe, but in the rhythm of survival, in the next meal, the next fire, the next morning. And somehow through it all you found the strength to keep waking up. Now the snow has started to melt. Not fast, not all at once, but you hear it, dripping off the tent posts, running through the camp like a promise. There's mud again. Mud means movement. The road will open soon, and spring might follow. You'll march again and fight again and curse your luck again. But tonight you sleep, not with one eye open, not with your hand on your dagger, just sleep. Because tonight you earned it. Close your eyes now. Let the fire crackle. Let the coal drift far away. And remember, in a winter that was never meant to be survived,